really natural. And I think it would be unreasonable for you not to kind of cut me some slack in that case. I think part of what's happening is that you think that that's a stress. That's not the real me. Like you think that I don't endorse the way that I'm acting. And so one thought that I've had is that we sometimes attribute a kind of apology to the person. We act as if, since we know the person probably doesn't really endorse that, isn't really that way, we act as if the person's already apologized to us, or something like that. But if I didn't, like if you knew that I stood behind it, if I identified with it, to put it in Frankfurtian terms, I don't know, that's how I think about that. But
okay, let's jump to bed.
Can I ask, in that case, with a person not acting by themselves, would you say that they're blameworthy or not blamable? Or is it the case that they're not blameworthy? I'm just curious if, like, do you think they've done something wrong? Or is it just the case that because of the situation, it's not a morally wrong action? Or is it morally wrong, but they're not blameworthy?
I think that's the only kind of case where I think somebody has done something morally wrong but isn't blameworthy. In most cases, I think an excuse actually shows that they didn't do anything wrong, which is kind of a radical view. I mean, most people want to carve out, well, you know, there are wrongs, but they're excused. But I think most excuses really just show us there wasn't really a wrong, and certainly not a blame grounding kind of wrong. But this case where, you know, I was under a lot of stress there, I do think, yeah, I did treat you with ill will. It's just that the standard that applies to me is a little different. We cut people some slack, but I don't really have a you about
it. So I guess I'm kind of surprised. I thought you were going to go with what your other view was.
Yeah, right. I mean,
maybe it just has the appearance of a wrong, but it's not actually wrong. But I don't know.
Yeah, it doesn't seem right to me, but I do agree that that's not consistent with what I want to say. That's why I find that question interesting, because I don't know what to say.
But in such a situation, would there be any bad will? I mean, a person is struggling to overcome some sort of situation, and he just maybe didn't even notice someone. I don't know.
You know, I was just writing about this, and I wrote something along those lines, that maybe what we want to do there is ascribe it to the situation or ascribe it to the stress, and so maybe it's kind of an appearance of ill will, but it's really the circumstances the person was in, not the person. Something like that, which is kind of like what you're suggesting, I think.
I would say it would be quite close, not the same, but quite close to the situation when the personality changed dramatically. And I believe when someone is trying to overcome something terrible, some small bad deeds would be excusable, like saying something impolite. It would be just not his reaction, but a reaction of some part of his mind, I don't know, which is just automatic. Maybe it's just this automatic reaction was wrong because it's also damaged with that situation. He was dealing with the situation, and some small part of his mind dealing with the present, while most of it is dealing with the past.
Well, I do agree. Let me say, and I know Sophia wants this, but yeah, if your spouse has died, or your father or your mother has died recently, and you behave in certain ways, you're cruel, maybe in a remark, or impatient, you might, diminish we might have diminished reactions and say, well, let's cut some slack. But, of course, under those circumstances, if the individual raped someone or committed a murder, we would still hold them accountable. I don't know that we diminish the punishment. And there are other cases, you know, let's say the President of the United States or a leader of a nation is in a very stressful circumstance. It must be that Barack Obama faces a lot of stress. And, you know, that doesn't get him off the hook. It's not okay for him to say, really, you know, there's all this stress. Putin is misbehaving. The Israelis and the Palestinians are misbehaving and fighting, and there are all these problems. The Republicans want to, you know, impeach me or planning to impeach me. I'm under a lot of stress, so I'm going to now whatever, you know.
Bomb everyone.
Pardon?
Bomb everyone.
Yes, throw bombs. Does that get him off the hook? No. So I mean, there's stress and there's stress. I don't know. Yeah.
That's a completely different situation.
Oh, yeah, it is a different.
Because it's professional. He entered it on his own.
So it's not stress qua stress, but maybe, we'd have to have a more nuanced explanation. Yes, Joe, and then Sophia. Yeah.
So one thing I was curious about is when you say somebody's stressed and that he wasn't himself when he was acting, I'm wondering if there might be two types of cases where that's involved. So in one type of case, maybe there's something that I find, maybe there's something I find generally irksome normally, but something I'm under a lot of stress, something like that, and I actually get mad at someone like disproportionately, something like that. Where normally I wouldn't have maybe even said anything. So that's one sort of case where it's sort of like a disproportionate response, but there was something maybe small there. Versus maybe a more passive case of just somebody doesn't. It's not that they're doing anything irksome, but I just fail to acknowledge them or something like. It seems like there's maybe two types of.
Yeah, maybe.
Cases.
Yeah, I just saying. Two types of cases, but do you think how does stress bear on them?
So it seems like. So I would say that it seems like you might be. So in the case where you're reacting to something and you sort of a disproportionate response. So in that case you might normally be blameworthy or excusing most of the blame, something saying, oh, that was just sort of stress, versus in the second case where maybe you just fail to acknowledge somebody, but you're just, because you're really stressed, it's not that you blow up at anybody, you just sort of like, I don't know, they say hi, you don't say, you don't respond, something like that. Maybe there's like no blame at all versus a little bit of blame.
Okay, good. Yeah, that's good. That's a little more subtle analysis. Sophia?
Yeah, okay. I was thinking, I read quite a lot of Christine Korsgaard, and I was thinking that her account of when you're supposed to hold someone responsible is pretty Straussian in a way. I just came to think about it because she says this in Creating the Kingdom of Ants, that holding people responsible should be guided by the virtues of respect and benevolence. And in some situations it's respectful to hold someone responsible, would be disrespectful not to. In other situations it's cruel to hold someone responsible, benevolent not to. And there are no clear-cut answers, but these should be your guides. And I came to think about, I mean, in a lot of situations it seems fairly clear how we're supposed to apply these principles. So if someone, say, were drugged against her will and then did something, it seems cruel to hold her responsible for that. And you can come up with examples of normal, rational agents where it's respectful to hold them responsible. But this cutting slack thing, I think, is really complicated. And I'm personally in a situation where there is this acquaintance of mine, not really a friend, just an acquaintance. And he's dying from an illness, and he's not like in a hospital hooked up to tubes. He seems like normal, but he's actually dying from an illness. And he can quite often be pretty nasty against people, to me and to everyone. And probably because he's under a lot of stress because he's dying. I'm sort of torn between, should I confront him about his nasty behavior? Or should I just cut him some slack? I've done that so far, just let things pass and just think to myself, poor thing is dying, so whatever. But I mean, I'm sort of torn. I don't know if I'm being benevolent or disrespectful. I think that's a tricky case.
Yeah, very.
I mean, could you imagine though, just because you're dying of a painful illness doesn't, how do you finish that sentence? Because I would think that just justifies a whole lot.
Yeah, but I mean,
it's
pretty pointless nastiness. What I think is that, I shouldn't put it like that, but I should maybe say like, okay, what you said now was nasty. You shouldn't have said that. That's what I think maybe I should say, rather than saying nothing and just thinking in my head, okay, that was pretty nasty, but he's under pressure, so I'm just sitting here, smiling.
And he wasn't nasty before? I mean, would that change our...
Yeah, that's also tricky because it never had a super pleasant personality, so that even further complicates things. So yeah, I think just cutting slack situations are really complicated.
They're very complicated. I don't think they admit of a unified explanation. I was thinking we might cut someone slack when their parent has just died, or they've just gone through some painful event, or I mean, I remember I had a colleague for many years who was a concentration camp survivor. I mean, he was a very young boy, and he was in a concentration camp. He actually escaped at some point, and during the escape, he actually killed someone, and this was when he was a young boy. And I guess the theory of some of these people who were in concentration camps when they were quite young is that they, you know, as opposed to people who are older when they get put in a situation like that, they don't have a baseline of normality against which to judge this, you know. So it's really problematic. And so this person did behave. This was a colleague who behaved badly in a lot of ways. You probably don't.
I know who you're talking about.
He or she will remain nameless, but I myself knew what he had gone through, and I just cut him slack. I said, oh, that's just, he or she is just doing that thing, but I cut him slack just because of what he had gone through.
Yeah, I think my problem comes from, if I try to imagine myself in that situation, so okay, I have this serious problem, I should say slowly dying, it might take perhaps a year or two. Like, so I'm in this situation, it's admittedly very bad. And I'm going around being nasty against people, and I don't really like the thought of these people just, you know, behaving civilly to me while thinking in the privacy of their heads that I'm a nasty person, but they're not going to say anything. I don't like that thought, and then at the same time it kind of feels wrong to confront someone in the situation.
Well, if I could say this, it is interesting that you said, you pointed out that Korsgaard's theory is quite Strawsonian, and I think, I don't know if this is what you were thinking of, but the way I think of it, it's Strawsonian in the sense that she's not saying that control or freedom of any sort is what justifies us in, you know, applying the reactive attitude. She's doing it normatively entirely. What I would like to say, but I mean, I agree that this pushes all the nuances and difficulties back to the theory of blameworthiness, or perhaps the theory of all things considered blame. But what I want to say is, all these individuals are responsible. It's just, now it's a question of how blameworthy they are, or whether we should target them with blame. But then all the messiness comes there. And I don't have, I mean, I think responsibility is easier because you can give, in my view, a kind of elegant, simple explanation. You have to have guidance control, and the epistemic condition has to be met. But there are all these multifarious factors that diminish blameworthiness, I think. It's a messier, nastier, more difficult thing. How about he wasn't himself? This seems problematic. Like, what if I ordinarily am quite honest in department meetings and so forth, but then someday I tell this lie, and subsequently when my department chair confronts me, I say, well, look, I'm usually an honest person, I just wasn't myself.
If you have some sort of account, I think, I mean, so Strawson says something like, for all it's being logically comic, we ought to, because there's, you know, there's one reading of that, a sort of uncharitable reading, which it's just contradictory, but let's table that. For all it's being logically comic, he thinks there's something to it. This idea that, if I could find the passage, I would, but it said we ought not hold the person that he is responsible for the actions of the person that he is not. Mm-hmm. The idea that he really was acting under influences that make it the action not attributable to him, but rather him in that context. And since we normally have to do with him under normal circumstances, you know, I don't know. I find that partially compelling, but
Ben?
I think there's these kind of cases, like our character cases. I think there's quite a few different types of cases. So one case might be that he seems not himself, or he seems to be acting out of character in a really kind of epistemic way, in the sense that he seemed like a very honest person, but then he told this big lie, claimed not to be himself, but we've actually learned something new.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Turns out he's actually done something bad. Whereas a case where someone's acting genuinely out of character, where like they are actually a genuinely honest person, but something has forced them to act in a dishonest way, that case, that does seem like an excuse, but in the other case, I think it's not an excuse. We've just learned that they actually are a bad person, but maybe there are other sorts of cases.
But I'm not sure what the excuse there seems, the way you put it is he's genuinely an honest person, but something brings him to tell a lie. So that's what's doing the work. It's not just that he told a lie, but rather that something brought him to, and that's I think what needs to be analyzed further. Because it can't just be something caused him to tell a lie, because if his friend said, maybe you should tell a lie now, and he does, you know, it has to be by some process, and that's, you know. Oh, okay, sorry, Arjun.
I think that Strawson gives us a good hint for understanding this plea he was not himself. Look, then he says that it's the same thing as he was acting under post-hypnotic suggestion. And I believe that all of us would agree that a hypnotized person is not responding, doesn't respond for her or his actions. And probably we might say that, well, there is a person responsible for hypnosis, but probably the agent was put in this hypnotic state by circumstances. And technically, like from medical, physical point of view, it's like the same state. Well, maybe would that work?
Yeah. Well, I would say if you don't consent to the hypnosis, then you wouldn't be responsible. But if you consent to, you know, if you voluntarily go to a hypnotist and she hypnotizes you in a specific way that you wanted, then I think you can be responsible. But yeah. Dimitri?
Yeah, the interesting cases of multiple personality disorder, I wonder what's because I know that there was a debate about whether it's nothing, you know, like it's a genuine illness or it's really not, and I think it was sometimes qualified differently. It was renamed as dissociative identity disorder at some point, and I don't know whether now there is a consensus about the problem, I mean, how to treat these cases, and whether they're afflicted by the doctors themselves or they're authentical. And so what would be your you know, interpretation of blame and moral responsibility? And just before, you know, just I got a little confused now after we spoke about your view and the Strawsonian view about blame and moral responsibility. As I understand that Strawson would not separate the moral responsibility from the blameworthiness, and you seem to do so. Can you be more explicit about how you like?
Well, let's see. Well, I think you could be morally responsible for morally neutral acts. You know, I think I'm morally responsible for raising my glass, so it wasn't right or wrong, it was permissible. I also think you could be morally responsible for an act that's wrong, but what I was saying before is, but not be blameworthy for it. But you know, that's quite contentious.
What does that mean? Like, you are morally responsible but not blameworthy. So like, how do you behave towards that person? So you don't blame him, but you say is that you just say that he's morally responsible?
Well,
is there any action or is there any like reaction?
What I want to say is, he's responsible means he's an appropriate target for blame. It wouldn't be a category mistake. It wouldn't be inappropriate to blame him in a way in which it would be inappropriate to blame a lion or the cop. You know, to be resentful toward the lion for killing the lamb just it's a mistake of a certain deep sort. So I want to say that's what moral responsibility is. It's aptness for these attitudes. But then there may well be considerations that show that the agent is not praiseworthy or blameworthy for the action, even if it's a wrong action. I think if the agent were subjected to pressures, actually subjected to pressures, which is such that anyone who developed the normal human capacity of control couldn't reasonably be expected to resist, then arguably the agent, though he's responsible, is not blameworthy. Now, people were convincing me that perhaps one could go a different way, and one could say, yes, he is blameworthy if it's wrong, but the fact that he was subjected to these pressures indicates that we ought not, all things considered, blame him. Now, Strawson, I think, thinks that moral responsibility is aptness or appropriateness for the reactive attitude. So we agree on that. The disagreement is more, and so I think, let's see.
And Strawson just doesn't say much about, right? He doesn't use...
The reactive attitudes are constituents of the moral responsibility. So there I see that that's contradictory to what John was saying.
Well, I see. Aptness or proneness to apply the reactive attitudes is part of our responsibility practices. In other words, but I think what... Was this what you were saying, that Strawson himself doesn't explicitly address the issue of whether he could be responsible for a neutral act?
Yeah, and he doesn't even use the word blame very much. The standard interpretation is his view of blame is that resenting is blaming or something, but he doesn't actually say that. He talks about moral responsibility and he talks about resentment. He uses the word blame like maybe twice. He doesn't really focus on, he doesn't use that word a whole lot, and he certainly doesn't have talk about the relationship between blame and moral responsibility. But I take it the standard view is something like blameworthiness requires moral responsibility. You're blameworthy only if you're morally responsible. You're praiseworthy only if you're morally responsible. But a lot of people agree with what John said, that you can be morally responsible without being either praiseworthy or blameworthy. And I think that makes sense, because I think our concept of moral responsibility doesn't involve the idea of rightness or wrongness, goodness or badness of the action. Our idea of moral responsibility involves the idea of control. And I can have the control over a morally neutral action, like just lifting the cup. So we should allow, it's weird, and we don't focus on these cases, but we should allow for saying, I'm morally responsible for lifting the cup, just because I have the right kind of control over it. Now, if lifting the cup were a bad action, because by doing that I was signaling the assassin to fire, and that's John's example, then I might be blameworthy. Or if it was a good action because I was lifting the cup to give it to somebody who's dying of thirst, then it would be I'd be praiseworthy for it. It would be a praiseworthy action. But just lifting it in a morally neutral way is something I'm morally responsible for because I have the right kind of control over it, such that if it were bad, why do we add the moral qualifier? Yeah, because we have to do that, because otherwise we'll confuse it with causal responsibility. And I'm not just causally responsible for it.
Well, causes and responsibility, I think the control is the difference. Like causes don't have a control over the result, the action.
Yeah, I agree that it is a bit odd, but I do think it's best because it does involve me as an agent and not just a kind of impersonal cause. I'm engaged in it as an agent. Right. But it's not it has no moral significance. So I know that that's weird, and I've actually changed my view about that, but I agree with John now that that's probably the best way to mark up the territory.
Well,
but you don't have to.
You add moral because it's an openness or availability to, or susceptibility to distinctively moral attitudes. The reactive attitudes like resentment, indignation, and so forth are distinctively moral. So even if you're not actually targeted with one of those, you're open to it, you're an appropriate candidate. It wouldn't be a category mistake to apply those to you, and those are distinctively moral. So, right, Matt was saying there's a distinction between causal and moral responsibility. So if I sneeze and knock over my glass of water, I caused the mess, I caused the water to be spilled. I'm causally responsible, but I'm not thereby accessible to, these reactions for doing that. Unless I've been having a lot of coughing and sneezing, and I should have been more careful. But, so I think that's why it's distinctively moral. It's an openness. But what I would say, so rather than focusing on this issue about whether you could be responsible for a neutral act or not, as what distinguishes Strawson from me, what I think is better is that Strawson thinks responsibility isn't grounded in or based in some notion of control, but I think it is, though it's not freedom to do otherwise. Yeah, Dave? Yeah.
Yeah, so I was just thinking, maybe some of the difficulty when it comes to this sort of back and forth on moral responsibility for morally wrong or bad actions, but without blameworthiness, is it seems like sometimes you say the agent is not blameworthy for X, but the agent is nevertheless still morally responsible, and then you say, well, look, they have these capacities, they are moderately reasons responsive, that sort of thing.
They
but
exercise control.
Yeah, but it seems though, like it's one thing to say they're a morally responsible agent, but they're not blameworthy for this action X, and saying they're morally responsible for X, but not blameworthy for X.
Right. I think it is two different things, but I think you can say both. I think your mechanisms of guidance control can issue in or cause the behavior, and it could be wrong, but nevertheless you not be blamed. But I don't know how much we want to. I think that is a good distinction, but I would want. Anyway, other comments. Yes, and by the way, we want to open it to any discussion of the Watson paper because, in a sense, we've just focused on Robert Harris and some features of Strawson, but if people want to bring up anything in the Watson, that's good. But okay, let me get to Sean.
So I had a question about a different aspect of the Strawson.
Good,
so
okay.
I want to talk a little bit more about this.
The inevitability claim. So he sort of makes this claim that our blaming practices are kind of inevitable. Yes. We couldn't do without them, and if we could, it wouldn't be a good thing. And I'm just not entirely sure what's supposed to follow from that. So I mean, it's not obvious to me that that claim, even if true, weighs in on the kind of discussions that we have as philosophers, right? So even if it's true that people in general can't give up on these kinds of practices, we can still have a debate about whether a certain group of people ought to be, for instance, punished or whatever. And if you imagine that philosophers are in control of this sort of thing, we can have a meaningful and very important debate about the proper extension of blameworthiness that doesn't seem to be affected by the fact that people need these practices in their daily lives.
Well, yeah, I think that is right, that even if you accept Strawson's claim of, I don't know, excessive difficulty or impossibility of giving up the reactive attitudes and still living recognizably human life, you could still, within that framework, have a debate about the proper extension of praiseworthiness, blameworthiness, responsibility, yes. So that is, we could still have debates. I think what it's supposed to bear on, or one thing it bears on is compatibilism, because if we were to ascertain that determinism is true, according to Strawson, we would still keep our reactive attitudes. We couldn't give them up. And so that shows that determinism is compatible with responsibility. I mean, people have found this problematic. I mean, it almost sounds like a kind of wishful thinking, or, you know, we want it to be true. I mean, it's like, it's a very desirable feature of our lives that we can have interpersonal relationships. We don't want to be isolated and live sterile, lonely lives. We want to be in these deep interpersonal relationships. And so it's almost as though Strawson is saying, because it would be highly desirable to keep them, and extremely difficult and costly to get rid of them, we shouldn't get rid of them even if we find that determinism is true and there is some theoretical reason to think that determinism would rule out these. I mean, that has seemed problematic to people, or excessively complacent, or a kind of wishful thinking. Wanting makes it so. I don't know if you think, what you think of that. But.
What are the best criticisms of Strawson along those lines? So there's Galen Strawson's paper, which I can't remember the title of, and Russell's Strawson's way of naturalizing blame or naturalizing responsibility, that criticize these aspects of the view.
Yeah, so what famously, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No.
Famously what Galen Strawson argues, so Galen Strawson's Peter Strawson's son, so of course he has to disagree with his father. And what he said is, no, we can imagine human lives, not just without indignation and resentment, but without any of the reactive attitudes. They'd still be recognizably human. And he used a Zen Buddhist monastery as an example, where a really strict Zen master seeks no self, or at least tries to expunge anything like resentment, indignation, hatred, and arguably this could still be an attractive, recognizably human life. So Galen Strawson argued that it's just not true that we wouldn't be able to recognize as human or desirable a life without the reactive attitudes. Others have argued that, well, certainly we could recognize and find appealing human lives where the retributive reactive attitudes like indignation and resentment and hatred are eliminated. So that was one of the kind of major critiques, I suppose.
And that paper's in your the Perspectives on Moral Responsibility book that he and Mark Revisa edited too.
There's one thing that Peter and Galen have in common, basically.
Last name.
Except for that. I mean, Peter Strawson, he just asserts that our moral responsibility practice, as it looks, it recognizes this list of excuses, and none of these excuses generalizes. And Galen Strawson, he asserts that our moral responsibility practice, as it actually looks, according to that, we only should hold people morally responsible for what they did if they also are morally responsible for what caused them to do what they did, and morally responsible for that infinite regrets threatens. So they both just assert something about our practice, and they don't really back it up with anything except perhaps some anecdotes or something.
Yes, I think that's right. I think that's right. So there's I think I would say, and Matt also mentioned Paul Russell's critical discussion of Strawson and ethics, and this was an important article. I think the main idea was, at most, Strawson is right about our dispositions toward the reactive attitudes. That is, it would be really hard to imagine us actually eliminating this proneness or inclination or disposition to have indignation, resentment, so. But it's a separate question whether we could perhaps adjust and eliminate actually acting on those dispositions, and that's something that perhaps is in fact conceivable and possible. At least, I mean, the crucial distinction was between this proneness or disposition toward the reactive attitudes and actually following through and applying the reactive attitudes. And what Russell suggests is, we could imagine a human life in which you didn't actually follow through and do the things like have hatred or resentment or indignation when you're inclined to have it. I mean, the inclination will be hard to get rid of, but not the actual action from that inclination. There's another. I mean, the other, I think, major critique is by Susan Wolf, in which she worries about this point that wishing that we have the reactive attitudes because they're in our interest or desirable for the purposes of this very valuable fabric of interpersonal relationships shouldn't make it justified. That's just saying we'd like it to be the case. It's like wishful thinking is driving the argument. So she pushes that worry.
Mm-hmm. I think.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Angelina?
Yeah.
Or did you have something? Oh no, Yishai?
I was wondering if maybe there's just a very weak notion of control that even Strawson is committed to, namely that we sometimes act. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure how he takes the notion of exhibiting a quality of will, if it's supposed to be exhibiting a quality of will through one's action. But one could be like an agency incompatibilist and say that action itself requires indeterminism, mm-hmm. and thus if it turns out that we don't act, then that undermines responsibility. But I suppose Strawson could just say, well, whatever it is that's going on, whether it's an action in this technical sense or not, we can be responsible for that, irrespective of whether or not determinism is true. Do you think that would be the kind of response that Strawson would?
He might say that, or he might just say there's no reason to think that action requires indeterminism. Yeah, I know. You know, there's an interesting argument by Helen Stewart to that effect, but I don't think he would accept that at all. But, you know, acting somehow requires indeterminacy. What do people think? You know, one of the most important features, and we'll talk extensively about this tomorrow, but it might be good to keep it in mind as one of the important features of Watson's article is he suggests that on a Straussonian view, and in general, moral responsibility should be modeled on a conversation. So it's this conversational model. And the idea is, and of course, as Matt pointed out, Michael McKenna has further developed this kind of model in a recent book. But the idea is when an offender does something, commits a crime or commits an offense against you, it's as though he's making a statement. I mean, somehow the male pronoun seems appropriate here, though he, but women can also commit crimes and offend people, but let's say he is making a statement. He's saying something like, your interests don't matter, my interests matter more than yours. But he's kind of making a statement, and then the reply by the person who's the victim is to have a kind of reactive attitude, like resentment. I resent you for your action in accordance with your belief that I don't matter. Your action that expressed this belief that I don't really matter, or I don't matter as much as you do. So then resentment is the next, let's say, move in the conversation. But then that resentment, as you know, Strawson points out, invites, to use that term, another attitude on the part of the offender. It invites the attitude of guilt or shame. And so you kind of go back and forth and you think of moral responsibility as a conversation. And then as Matt pointed out, an implication of this seems to be that just like in a conversation, it's pointless or absurd to speak to someone who can't speak the language that you're speaking. So it would be pointless for me to start speaking in German to someone who I know doesn't speak German at all. It's pointless. Similarly, it might be that it's pointless to seek to reach an agent who can't understand the claim in question. So having resentment, for instance, to someone who can't grasp moral reasons seems to be pointless. So,
and more than that, unfair, inappropriate, something like that.
Yeah. So then one implication of that would be that as Gary Watson believes, psychopaths are not apt targets for the reactive. They're not morally responsible because they can't speak the language of moral responsibility. Okay, what do you think about this? Yeah. Dan.
So I think it's a really interesting picture.
Yeah.
I think it captures a lot of what happens in interpersonal relationships. Scanlon, for example, says there's the moral relationship that we bear with, so every other moral agent. But I mean, in the closer relationships, I think it does capture it's sort of like a conversation. But I think it happens so often that you can bear resentment or anger or indignation towards someone you don't know. You can have private blame, which is blame where you just have maybe the belief that they've acted wrongly or disregarded you or shown you ill will, plus a reactive attitude based on that belief. And then there could be cases where you don't care to communicate. There's no intention to communicate with this person. I'm not looking for you to receive it. I just have it towards you. And so one, people who we don't know well.
Yeah.
Two, people who we do know well, but it's private or we don't care whether they receive it. And then people who aren't even within earshot or communication of us. I mean, I can blame Kim Jong-un for being such a bastard. I don't think the blame doesn't have a point. I think that it makes perfect sense. It doesn't seem like, well, that's pretty unfortunate. It doesn't really make sense for you to blame him. Of course it makes sense for me to blame him.
Right.
But it's not a conversation. I don't intend to communicate something to him.
Well, also Dimitri's nice example of blaming the dead, presumably. Unless, now, in my immortality project, I do hear from many people who think they can't communicate with the dead. But I mean, mainly we don't think we can converse with the dead. Some of them think they can converse with their dead cats, but that's a different thing.
I think it sounds strange to say that you could have no intention of communication, even in cases when the person is alive and so on. Because spontaneously I would think about blaming the dead and stuff like that as parasitical upon the practice of blaming real living people. Yeah. And I think that if I were to blame you, okay, I might not expect that you're going to listen to me. I might be quite certain that you're not going to listen to me, but I still make some kind of attempt. And I would still prefer that you did listen to me and said like, oh shit, you're completely right, I was terrible, oh, you know. I mean, if I'm completely indifferent to your reaction, if I think that I'm just as fine with you stubbornly refusing to see my point as I would be with you going, yeah, you're right, oh, I'm sorry, I was terrible. I mean, that just seemed really, really strange to me if I were indifferent between those two scenarios.
You would be assuming that there's no such thing as private blame.
Yeah, obviously you could privately blame someone, but I think that as blaming the dead, that would be parasitical upon the practice of blaming someone face to face, and that still sort of carries with it a kind of preference for, I mean, if I privately blame John in my head, that still contains a sort of preference for John realizing that, oh, I was terrible to Sophia before and feel guilty about it.
But can't we say that our practice of blaming people with whom we can't communicate is parasitical on our practice of blaming people with whom we can? So blaming Harris, say Harris isn't a potential moral interlocutor, but my blaming him is just what I would be doing if he were a potential moral interlocutor, and he's like a dead person. I would like for him to respond appropriately.
Possibly, but at some point it became unintelligible to have this preference, like with a lamppost or whatever. And
yeah, well, I mean, we'll talk about that a lot tomorrow. But you know, he's really different from a lamppost, right?
Yeah, he is, and I'm not sure about. I'm not sure about psychopaths, okay? But I could agree with you that in principle, yeah, it might sometimes blaming someone with whom you can talk might be. I mean, there might be a possibility of communication, and it still might be somewhat parasitical on blaming more normal people who at least gets what you're saying, even if they refuse to see your point.
So there's a continuum, right? Between you got some inanimate objects, and then you got non-human animals, maybe children, fully formed, morally responsible adults. And one way to think about the question is where the entity we're talking about falls, and what's the boundary of the moral community? Does this psychopath, we'll talk about that tomorrow, but somebody like Harris, is he more like a non-human animal than like a normal human being? And I tend to think that we're probably, anybody who's minimally rational is much more like us than like a non-human animal. Even though non-human animals in a way act for reasons, in the sense that we could give an account of what they did in terms of goals and so forth.
But what is the answer to some of Dan's questions? Like, what would the proponent of the conversational model say? I mean, I might blame Kim Jong-il or Saddam Hussein, or I blame Hitler. I'm indignant at Hitler for what he did. But that's not part of a conversation. Or, I mean,
Gary thinks that you can do it. Yeah. He doesn't explain how. I mean, I think he thinks there's just an obvious answer, but he gives it. Okay. And Michael McKenna, I don't know.
Do you know what?
No, I don't
know. You're our representative from Arizona.
I don't.
Maybe one thought is that that sort of moral responsibility conversation isn't always between the sort of victim and the offender. It might just be between the victim and other members of the moral community, or the victim themselves. Yeah. Because I think some people like the idea of like when you blame people, blaming isn't always because you want to show the offender that they've harmed you in some way. It's also a useful way to remind yourself that you've been harmed by that person, even if that person wouldn't listen to your blame. It just reminds you that they've done a bad thing.
That's the point that I make in that protest paper that I was talking about earlier. I say blame isn't necessarily aimed at getting a response of any sort. It can be sort of planting a flag for morality and your own view of yourself as somebody who deserves respect, and maybe fellow sufferers too. So you can be communicating with yourself, you can be communicating with fellow victims. You don't have to be communicating with the victimizer, so it doesn't necessarily matter if the victimizer can uptake, can
that seems plausible to me. I don't think Michael McKenna says that.
No, he doesn't. He doesn't think that. No,
it seems like a plausible way for them to view.
But they do want to say. I mean, someone like Gary Watson wants to say, psychopaths are not responsible because they can't understand the invitation. I mean, resentment's an invitation to feel, to reflect, to see what one did was wrong, and to have guilt. And the psychopath just can't understand that language, and so he's not responsible. So there, I mean, but the rest of the community might understand that. So there, we're thinking the rest of the community is not the target; it's the offender.
Maybe this is a bit a bit implausible, but maybe in a way the psychopath, even though they don't speak the language, they've still managed to initiate a conversation using that language, just unintentionally. Like maybe there's something like that going on, but I don't know how plausible that is.
Yeah, that's good.
I think that's right. I mean, I think they're well, again, we talk about this tomorrow, but I think that psychopaths' actions have moral significance, even though they're not capable of making judgments with moral content.
One more I do have about what I just said, though, is when you mentioned animals, because animals might do the same thing, like initiate these kind of conversations, but we wouldn't want to say that we don't want to blame animals for what they do, so there'd have to be some sort of difference between the psychopath and the animal.
There's a footnote in the, so look for it when you read Watson's paper for tomorrow, but there's a footnote where he says, and maybe, you know, if a lion is stalking you, he says it's probably really hard not to take that personally, because he is tracking your demise, you know, literally. And
yes, Joe.
So I'm curious about maybe some of the limit cases of the conversation model where somebody either once was a part of the moral community and whether they can possibly leave it once they've joined it. So somebody who, so in the Harris case, it seems like he is still perhaps part of the community because he's explicitly rejecting it, as opposed to, I don't know, just sort of trying to completely step aside from it. And then it's sort of this interesting question of maybe whether you can leave it all, and if you can leave, what are the circumstances, or can you, I guess you probably have to tell some sort of story of how you can join, because children surely aren't, but then become part of it, so something like that. So.
Yes, Angelina.
Just wanted to say that if you react somehow on a psychopath, if you show that you was hurted by him, it's also kind of support the basic ideas that are in your community. I mean, if you don't do it, it also kind of makes you or not a part of your community, or also it kind of questions, if everyone in this community start to react on psychopaths, it's kind of be different community.
Now, one thing that we could say, though, is that, well, psychopaths are responsible in this attributability sense. So it is their action. It is bad. It's perfectly reasonable for us to sequester, to take them off the streets, to protect ourselves from them. But it might not be reasonable to resent them, to hold them accountable for their behavior. So that would be something that Gary Watson has open to him to say. So you could support, we can protect ourselves as a community without engaging in this, because we got recourse to this form of responsibility to say, yeah, you did that. You're responsible for it in the sense that you did it, and it was bad. You're a bad guy, and we can protect ourselves from you. But it would be inappropriate for us to punish you in a retributive way. We're not inflicting harm on you just for the sake of harming you, because it's good for you to suffer. We're putting you in prison, we're inflicting harm on you to protect ourselves from you.
Yes, Sean.
So just a question of clarification about what you just said. So the question of whether retributivism is right or whether punishment is ever justified is distinct from whether people have attributability responsibility or accountability responsibility, right?
Well, whether it's justified, but most people, when they talk about accountability, they think that punishment is part of accountability.
But the way you presented these were different accounts of what blaming is.
Right. So you said the attributability was the view of the act of blame as just having a cognitive attitude, as opposed to accountability.
Yeah. So they can be. So people talk like that. They can say there's blame, there's attributability blame, and there's accountability blame. Where attributability blame is just attributing bad stuff, attributing vices. Yeah. And then accountability blame would be punishing, retributively based punishment, negative reactive attitudes, that sort of thing.
There's also a bit of a discussion of whether there's a third conception. I mean, David Shoemaker argued that there is answerability as a third conception. And if that is a third conception, then answerability means that you can legitimately ask the person, why did you do what you did, present your reasons, I demand of you that you do better in the future. Accountability, you have the right to punish the person. Attributability, that's more like a pure evaluation. Then Angela Smith argued that it doesn't make sense to have three conceptions, because attributability, either it's the same as answerability, or it's something completely non-moral, like when you evaluate the temperament of a dog or a horse. So
so the third one would go in here. So one would be, they did an act, you can attribute to them, it could have a moral valence. Answerability would be, they're rational in a way that it makes sense to ask them why they did what they did.
Yeah, and you can be, and like Pierre Bombellis as answerability, but not accountability, because the latter would presumably
that
require agent causation, and we don't have that.
So is the ledger view an example of an attributability?
That's confusing. I think, in a way, I think some of these titles aren't really helpful, because it's actually hard to shoehorn views under one or the other. Watson talks about, he gives an example of, he uses Glover as an example. Glover is the characteristic ledger view. But he also suggests it's an attributability view. So interesting. Okay, there's some history here that's interesting, and I was going to talk about it tomorrow. But Watson publishes the Two Faces paper in 1980 or 1996, maybe, something like that, I think. And that was in response to Susan Wolf's book, Freedom Within Reason. In Freedom Within Reason, Susan Wolf talks about the real self view, what she calls elsewhere the deep self view. And she says that's not a good view, because that just involves people causing their actions. The example she gives of the real self view is Watson's view, the view that Watson develops in Free Agency back in the 70s. It's a hierarchical view. It just says your value has to be what John calls a mesh view. You have to be acting on your own values that you endorse and all that. So Watson's view was the preeminent real self view. In the Two Faces paper, Watson says, I'm going to call what Wolf calls real self views, I'm going to call them self-disclosure views. And then Watson says that those are bad. But he never mentions that the view that what Wolf was talking about was his own view. So the view that he says is really limited, the attributability view, the self-disclosure view, was actually his own view. So, so attributability views initially were hierarchical views. Ledger views were views like Michael Zimmerman and Jonathan Glover, where we say blaming somebody is putting a negative mark on their moral record, which is like what Watson calls arretaic responsibility. So these things are not neatly distinguishable, and I think it's probably not worth it to use some of this terminology. I think it's overused and it's not super clear. But I think that's an interesting history. That Watson, the view that he's criticizing, is, if you follow the history back, is really his own view.
What do people think, or does anyone have any reflections on what should we call it, the practical argument or the pragmatic justification of responsibility, i.e. the argument that really it would be too costly for us to give up the reactive attitudes. And specifically, he wants to say we couldn't have interpersonal relationships, friendship, love, deep collaboration without indignation and resentment and hatred even. Is that right, do you think? There's that question. There's the question, could we have interpersonal relationships without indignation and resentment? And then there's another question, is it justified to keep the reactive attitudes because they are highly desirable, even if there are theoretical reasons to think that they're not warranted? Because that's explicitly what he says. Even if we had theoretical reasons to think that the reactive attitudes are problematic, we either couldn't give them up or shouldn't give them up because they're just too valuable to us. That seems really problematic to me, but Artum?
As I understand Strawson, he ties the reactive attitudes to community and society. He several times repeated this. And if it's so, I think it means that reactive attitudes might be conditions for the very existence of community. That's a strong way of interpretation of this claim, and I think that it's the best way for Strawson to save the reactive attitudes. But to my mind, I have already mentioned this place where he says that Look, even if we know from some rational source that determinism is true, our like irrational attitudes would not change. But look, there are a lot of rational spheres of social life, like, the law, politics, and so policy. And if determinism is true, as far as I understand this phrase of Strawson, probably it would impact on these spheres, some rational spheres of our life, and probably it might make back to morality. So, like we like Firboom, I think, says something of this. We make some theoretical conclusion that we don't need to put people under custody for some periods. Either it must be a short period or it might be a long period. And we accept this practice, and this practice may have some back input to reactive attitudes.
Let me ask you, I mean, if you want to comment on the second point, great, but about the first point, if he said the reactive attitudes are necessary conditions of having a community at all, right, that would go a long way toward establishing the idea that we have to keep the reactive attitudes insofar as we're social animals, we want community. But is it plausible that the reactive attitudes are necessary? I mean, what about the possibility of a Zen Buddhist monastery or just communities? Quakers, don't Quakers in America, I don't know if they're in Europe as well, they don't believe in indignation, resentment, hatred, and yet they have pretty close-knit communities. Right? Yep.
So I'm tempted to think that you could get rid of the reactive attitudes, but you still have some responses with some content. But I'm not sure what the content would be, but you'd still have to. If someone does something, you'd still have to respond in some way. It may not have to be like a reactive attitude. I'm not sure whether that'd be a good or a bad thing, but it doesn't seem psychologically impossible to get rid of these things.
Right. That's the kind of thing Parable wants to say. Dimitri, and then back to Arjun.
I definitely think that those reactions are controllable. In other words, the extent, the scale of the reactive attitude seems to be under control. So I don't think that it is possible to completely eliminate the responsiveness, but as to the outer expressions, I think you can basically neutralize them, and it may be even beneficial for the society to eliminate the negative ones and to reinforce maybe the positive ones, because everybody in moral responsibility is talking about negative ones. It clearly indicates that the society is so it's just so angry at itself. Obsessed with people killing. All the examples are about killing people and how we're horrified with their deeds. Right. And there's very little examples of the positive.
Right. One of the nice things actually about Strawson's article is he thinks he gives us a list of reactive attitudes which include the good ones.
The gratitude,
moral praise, gratitude.
They're not in the title, though.
Yeah, they're not in the title. But then what happens is he focuses on resentment throughout the article. But he does think, at least he defines responsibility in this broader way. Of course, Jay Wallace restricts, I mean, Jay Wallace argues that there are reasons to think of restricting the list and just having the negative ones as far as I can see. Okay.
Well, not that we ought to have just negative reactive attitudes,
no, but
theoretically
that's what responsibility is.
Yeah.
And I think Jay Wallace, I think his argument is problematic here because I think he thinks we need to tie together in some basic way, we need to tie together all of the attitudes that are part of moral responsibility by reference to some more basic idea. Yeah. And that's why he thinks you have to get rid of love and respect and gratitude, because they're not tied together in the same way as the others, indignation, resentment, and so. But my idea would be, well, why think we do have to in any way other than this is the set of attitudes that hang together as the attitudes distinctive of persons rather than non-persons. I mean, that's what ties them together, arguably. But in any case,
and just to be clear, Wallace isn't saying we should get rid of love. He means that love wouldn't fall under the title reactive attitudes. The title reactive attitudes would refer just to the negative ones. Right. But I don't understand the motivation for that either.
Yeah, I think it's been influential, but I think it's a little.
Well, really, do people?
It's just a certain kind of love, he says.
Sorry.
It's just a certain kind of love that would disappear if we got rid of them all.
Yeah, I don't know, but
adult romantic love, right? Adult romantic love, he said.
Would this?
Oh, Strawson.
You could still love your children, for instance, or.
Yeah, reciprocal love, he says, right?
Would disappear.
Oh, it's when he talks about the objective attitude.
Yeah.
When he says you can wrestle with them, but you can't hate them or something like that. You couldn't. Yeah, it's in that section. So it's under the exemption or the type 2 category.
Who's in the queue? Okay, Arjun.
Well, I wanted to respond to what Nitro said a few minutes ago. Right. Look, there are also good objective, good reactive attitudes, and for example, three Strawson's pleas, three Strawson excuses, they also withdraw moral responsibility for good actions.
Right.
And we must not forget about it. And to defend Strawson's position against this Zen society argument, he might say that right, it would be good to withdraw blame from our resentment from our practice, but there is no reason to withdraw good attitudes. And as far as I understand, in like Zen monasteries, there are some reactive attitudes, and in the least case, Strawson could say that in any society, our attitude to a person would be different from an objective attitude to like a robot looking like a person. So there are any attitudes in.
Yes, good point. And yeah, I agree. I think so. Galen Strawson, as I pointed out, argued against his father that you could have a recognizably and choice-worthy or a potentially choice-worthy, desirable form of life which gets rid of at least some of the reactive attitude, but arguably all of them. Then he referred to the Zen community. And my sense is that Peter Strawson might say, first of all, it's not clear that that's really an attractive form of life. It's really unclear. And secondly, even if it's in some sense recognizably human and choice-worthy to some degree, it wouldn't be a community in which there's moral responsibility. There's just not moral responsibility there. But in any case, I think it's a real, I mean, yeah, okay, I'm sorry. Dan, did you have something?
No.
Others, yeah, Oksana.
I'm the last one in the queue. I mean, if someone's before me.
I did find this passage.
Oh, okay. So, well, Matt, we'll read the passage, then we'll get
69, he said at the bottom, the objective attitude may be, and remember, so we take the objective attitude in this case of exemption, where somebody's not a proper target for the reactive attitudes. Oh, and as an aside, we didn't mention, Strawson does say you can temporarily do this, right?
Yeah.
So he says with the child, with the psychopath, you've got to take up the objective attitude. But he says you could do it voluntarily, but not permanently. So he thinks you can't permanently rid yourself of the objective attitude, but you can occasionally just take up this view from which you recognize that, his behavior is just the outcome of causal inputs that he had no control over. Anyway, though, so he says when you take up that objective attitude, that may be emotionally toned in many ways, but not in all ways. It may include repulsion or fear. It may include pity or even love, though not all kinds of love. So he thinks that there are, and then, yeah, so later on he must say, yeah. It cannot include resentment, gratitude, forgiveness, anger, or the sort of love which two adults can sometimes be said to feel reciprocally for each other. So there's some other kind of love that.
Yeah, but possibly you can love your children. Even, I mean, a baby. You can't have you can't have this reciprocal relationship with a baby, but you can still love a baby.
Yeah. But I guess we think the reciprocal love is more valuable. We wouldn't want to do without it. But I don't think. I think Watson is right that you could be a person who loves without being a person who resents. It seems plausible to me.
I wonder why we. Is it right that we are talking about one moral community? I believe there could be different moral communities in one in regard to the demand. Like the biggest moral community would probably be, for example, not to kill. And much smaller moral community would be, I don't know, don't eat meat. In the same community would be different.
Yeah. Right. I think that should be, though, compatible with a Straussian picture. But it's a good point that there are different subgroups morally. Yeah, no, go ahead.
Oh, so at least on Watson's interpretation, being a member of the moral community is just being the kind of thing that can respond to moral consideration.
Yes,
so this is really just this really.
It doesn't have to agree with, let's say, eating meat is okay or eating meat. It's just Joe.
So I had a question on unrelated points of
anyone following up. All right, go ahead, Joe.
So I also share the worry that the pragmatic argument that these things might be humans can't do without these reactive attitudes. Just because we can't do that doesn't mean that we ought not to, or something like that. I was wondering one way, and I don't know if Watson would take this, or sorry, I don't know if Strawson or Watson would take this line, but something like, depends on what we take the stakes of moral responsibility to be. So if we're taking, for instance, like the Galen-Strawson line of moral responsibility is this very, very, very strong thing. It's sort of like almost like a heaven and hell responsibility, I think is what he refers to it as. Then it seems like you're going to need this complete justification and almost these self-determined beings, something like that. But if we think it is this, if we take it in a more limited sense, then maybe it is less worrisome if we can't justify it from nowhere, something like that. I mean, and then there's a separate question of what the right conception of moral responsibility is. But one thing that might help him is sort of considering what stakes or what's at stake.
Yeah, good. Yeah, Sophia?
I'm not sure about that. I think it's kind of a mistake to think that if people are going to deserve to go to heaven or hell, we need some super strong freedom and self-creation. But if people are only going to deserve blame and praise in some ordinary social setting, we only require a less dramatic kind of free will. I think that what heaven and hell would require is some super strong ethical justification. I don't think they would require more freedom, the kind of freedom that is sufficient for people to deserve to be praised and blamed, not just for some kind of pragmatic reason. That freedom is going to be sufficient all the way, but maybe you can't, or I mean probably you can't ethically justify sending some people to heaven and some people to hell.
But if people could, you wouldn't need more responsibility, if you could justify it.
Yeah, that's what I think. And I think people tend to confuse freedom conditions with the possibility of an ethical justification. If people intuitively feel that this is difficult or perhaps impossible to ethically justify, they sometimes confusedly say that, I'm being mean to people now, I accuse others of being confused, but anyway, I think they sometimes then confusedly say that we can't possibly have the kind of freedom that justifies this, but actually it's a lack of ethical justification they sort of intuitively feel.
Well, it is a good question. It's a good, interesting point that Joe was making, but a good question. Why is it the case that for heaven and hell responsibility you need some super strong self-creation, but for merely, let's say, being subject to life in prison or the death penalty of this world, you don't require such a thing? I mean, it's not clear. But it's interesting. I want to push a little bit on this pragmatic justification because I think it is kind of problematic. I mean, as you recall, Strawson says, even if we had a theoretical conclusion to the effect that the responsibility practices were not warranted, we should still, we couldn't give them up and we should still keep them. But that, I mean, let's say you had a theoretical conclusion based on incompatibilist kinds of views. That is, you thought determinism rules out freedom to do otherwise, or determinism rules out sourcehood, and moral responsibility requires freedom to do otherwise, or moral responsibility requires sourcehood. So it would be deeply unfair in a deterministic world to hold someone responsible. Now Strawson says, okay, even if you believe it would be deeply unfair to hold them responsible, still it's desirable to hold them responsible. We get all these goodies by doing it, so we should keep doing it. Doesn't that seem, that just seems really objectionable. I mean, I don't know if that's fair to attribute that view to him, but that seems objectionable. Yes, Joe?
So, I guess one...
See, I should say, you know, recently I went to a conference. Matt was at this conference of people who were talking about Strawson. What was it, the 40th anniversary of the publication? Was it the 50th? Probably the 50th anniversary of the publication of Freedom and Resentment. I was one of the only people at this conference who had the temerity to ask questions, critical questions about Strawson's view, and it wasn't received with great enthusiasm, I think. But this is really a glaring problem, it seems to me. But yes, okay.
So I mean, one case that might, or an analogy that might help illuminate is that, I mean, if you take the case of ordinary intuitions about physics, strictly speaking, they're false, but and we do have good information for science, like that simultaneity, all these other things don't really hold. But we can still approximate them very closely with just sort of our ordinary notions do actually approximate them. But it seems like in the case where, or in the situation you were just describing, our everyday notions would not even remotely approximate the actual case. So it seems like it wouldn't just be, oh, we can kind of fudge it a little bit. Yeah. It would actually have to be this dramatic revision.
Yeah, I would think so. I would think so. Yeah, other.
Well,
yep.
So your objection was something like, even if you think it's deeply unfair to blame, we get all these goodies, as you so charitably put it. But if you were convinced it was deeply unfair, that would, on Strawson's own account, inhibit the negative reactive attitudes, right? Or it should. So that wouldn't.
If you thought, but I thought he thought even yeah.
I guess he thinks you could never really be convinced of it. But if you did become convinced of it, he wouldn't say, well, you should still blame.
Yeah, no, I thought that was what he really was arguing. Yeah, Dimitri?
Yeah, there's this experiment. You can wear some kind of glasses, and I'm not quite sure if I'm putting it right, but I guess you can wear some kind of glasses that make your vision upside down. And so when you start wearing those glasses, you feel, is it dizzy, or you know, it's hard to do stuff, but in about a day or 2 or 3, like probably a week, you totally get used to it, and you can drive your car and feed your baby at the same time you're wearing those glasses. For me, it seems that if at some point you were holding this incompatibilist position, and then suddenly there was an announcement in the newspapers that, hey, we found out that the world is deterministic, you would have that situation where it would be hard to orient yourself with like people. You would say, you would like try to withhold, you know, the reactive attitudes, and sometimes you wouldn't. But I think that in a week time, I think everything would just come back, and you would like do everything you did before. So I think that's probably my intuition about what would happen.
Of course, you know, we want to also ask what should happen. But yeah.
Maybe it shouldn't happen.
Right, but that,
Yeah, and that's right. I mean, I think that's true, right? It's hard not to resent, even if you're convinced you shouldn't. It's hard not to.
Mm-hmm.
But like, what is resentment? Resentment is when you say something, you're wrong, you should not do that to me, do not ever talk to me anymore like that. What is that? When you say resentment, what exactly do you mean? Is this the overt behavior?
No.
Okay,
no.
So this is some kind of
an emotional
response.
Which can be expressed through the overt behavior.
But then how, I don't think that when I have an emotional response, there's again the psychological study about how like excitement sometimes is the pressure and then this blood pressure and the heart rate can be mistakenly attributed to a feeling of sympathy and love and everything. So I think when there's this certain feeling arising from an action, you don't immediately know what it is unless you hear what you say. So it is possible that the reaction is some kind of emotional arousal of some kind, but whether it's fear or anger or resentment, these are all like the things that we can attribute based on the sentences that are being pronounced afterwards.
Yeah, I've heard.
There's no reason to say.
Which is strange. I mean, you wouldn't. This is really counterintuitive, but I've heard.
But I do have. I think there's, you know, well, you can go like as deeper in the terms of translation and other, you know. But I think that, and it's also Wittgensteinian in some way, I guess. But it's. How do you tell whether it is resentment or not? If you just like, yeah. What is that?
I think the philosophy of the emotions hasn't caught up with the psychological research, and it's pretty impoverished, and we just feel like we just make use of this language, and I feel guilty about it, actually. Like I should be much more familiar with the empirical research than I am, but nobody demands it of you when you work in this field, so you can kind of get away with just saying resentment, you know what I mean? And Strawson clearly doesn't have a...
He doesn't have the theory at all.
No.
He just said you can't give it up, but
right.
You don't really know what you...
I mean, I know that there are some people like Daniel Jacobson Darms. I don't know if people are familiar with their work. So there are some people who work on agency who are more in touch with some of the empirical literature on the emotions. Oh, and they say, so here's what they say about resentment, actually. They say that there's this very general, brute or primitive emotional response of anger, which can be, where they say, sharpened out by different cognitive states. So you could have, their example is tenure rage. Tenure rage would be anger at the thought that you had been denied tenure. And, you know, so there's a cognitive state, the belief that you've been denied tenure. But that would be resentment if you thought that you had been wronged by being denied tenure. So resentment is a cognitive sharpening of anger that has the character, that has the cognitive associated with the belief that you've been wronged. So when you're angry because you've been wronged or believe that you've been wronged, that's resentment. So there's a difference.
But there's a reflective, you have to know that something, the feeling of wrongness is you have to...
By your own lights, you know, by your sense of what you deserve.
I sometimes even, I think I deserve more. And then upon reflection, I said, oh no, probably I don't need this extra thing.
Yeah.
But
you could revise your judgment. I mean, sometimes you're resentful and then you realize, oh yeah, no, I'm wrong. I don't really deserve that. I mean, people can be wrong about what they deserve, right? You imagine the celebrity who thinks, you didn't pick out the green M&Ms from the bowl backstage. How dare you? I deserve. And they're like, no, you don't. So she's blaming, that celebrity is blaming the person, but it's wrong. She's wrong to do so. Because she hasn't been disregarded. She thinks she has been, but she's just wrong about what she deserves. Something like that. But yeah, this paper by Jacobson and Darms, I could probably put it online because I'm sure I have a copy of it. But it's called Anti-Quasi-Judgmentalism, which is a mouthful. But it's in an anthology about the emotions, philosophy of the emotions. It's a really good paper.
Yes.
I just had a quick question about the pragmatic argument.
Yeah, I was going to go back to that. Good.
Yeah. So even if it's true that we can't help but exhibit these reactive display these reactive attitudes towards other people, that only shows that we can't. And even suppose that if that were true, then it's good, all things considered, to have the practice of holding someone responsible. That doesn't speak at all with respect to the issue of whether or not someone is responsible. right? I mean, so it doesn't seem like it's that big of a deal that it might be true that we have most reason, all things considered, to continue this practice. It just doesn't speak to the issue about.
Well, only I mean, that presupposes that there is a distinction between being responsible and holding. But for Strawson, holding responsible just is being responsible. I mean, the practices in question are constitutive of moral responsibility.
But it has to be the notion of holding responsible under a certain circumstance. Or it has to be appropriate to hold responsible, right? There's still this notion of appropriateness.
Yeah, on one interpretation. Yeah.
Well, the criticism is that there isn't. I mean, that's their criticism of the view.
But I mean, there are these exempting conditions, right? One shouldn't hold responsible under these conditions where the agent isn't herself or whatever.
Right.
And that's what I was suggesting. That seems to build in, it's like kind of implicit, is this notion of appropriateness, because it's appropriate when you're not excused, and it's inappropriate when you are excused. So, sorry, but go ahead.
Good.
Yeah, so, but the appropriateness is supposed to be not a forward-looking kind of appropriateness, where if I resent someone, then it's going to result in the best action, the best outcome.
Yeah, because it would be consequentialist. It's backwards looking.
Yeah, right. But I kind of worry that the pragmatic argument is sort of forward-looking. So there's this notion of appropriateness that's independent of it being forward-looking. I kind of lost my train of thought there.
You're right, there is a kind of tension there, though. I mean, especially if you give the pragmatic argument a kind of strong interpretation like John was. It doesn't sit too well with his rejection of consequentialism at the beginning. Now, note, though, at the end, he says something like, construed correctly or generously, the optimist has the right position, and they're far from wrong in emphasizing the social utility of holding responsible. That's a paraphrase, but that's roughly what he says. So he has a lot of sympathy with the forward-looking view. He just doesn't think it gets everything because it denies our intrinsic interest in the reactive attitudes. They're not just, he says, they don't merely exploit our nature, they express our nature, these attitudes. They're not merely exploiting the fact that you don't want to be blamed, therefore I can get you to behave better by threatening to blame you. That's an exploitation of your nature. But they're expressing our nature insofar as I just have this intrinsic human interest, this natural interest in being treated with respect. You have a natural interest in not being resented and so forth.
About the pragmatic argument, quickly, on page 77 he says something interesting. I admit that I kind of gave a caricature and probably uncharitable of the pragmatic argument. But here, so on 77, really, at some point he's getting, what he wants to say is, okay, let's suppose that either it's impossible or very, very costly to give up the reactive attitudes. Still, there is a further question whether it would not be rational. Okay, so this is not the issue of whether, I mean, granted that it would be impossible to give up the attitudes or very difficult, you could still step back and ask whether it would be rational, given a theoretical conviction of the truth of determinism, so to change our world, that in it all these attitudes were wholly suspended. I must answer, as before, that one who presses this question has wholly failed to grasp the import of the preceding answer, the nature of the human commitment that is here involved. Here, I mean, this is really interesting. He says, it is useless to ask whether or not, whether it would not be rational for us to do what it is not in our nature to, and then in parentheses, be able to do. So he says it's not in our nature to do this, or it's not in our nature to be able to get rid of the reactive. So we shouldn't even ask this question whether it would be rational. It's useless. I mean, that doesn't seem fair to me. But okay, go ahead.
What you should say, I think, as some later philosophers have said, is that it would be morally wrong to completely give them up, because actually having these, expressing these attitudes shows that we take other people seriously. Right. Something along the lines of, I mean, Waller and Peerbohm agrees that it is painful to realize that you did wrong, and Peerbohm also agrees that if you construe guilt a little bit broader than what you're feeling is guilt, and he agrees that we should continue to feel this, but there's some kind of narrow guilt that we should get rid of. But anyway, there's a sense then also if we construe blame a little bit more broadly, that we have to blame ourselves if we're going to live moral lives. Now, if I blame myself, if I refuse to blame others, am I really being benevolent? Am I not just being a bit disrespectful because I hold myself to a higher standard than other people? With other people, I'm like, oh, he couldn't help it. I'm not like that with myself all the time. And you might say that's morally wrong, and because that would be morally wrong, we shouldn't do this.
Right, good. I mean, I agree that may be what he should say, but you know what he actually says is it's useless to even raise the question, which seems too strong. Then what's kind of important is he says, to this I must add, as before, that if there were, say, for a moment, open to us the possibility of such a godlike choice, the rationality of making or refusing it would be determined by quite other considerations than the truth or falsity of the general theoretical doctrine in question. The latter would simply be irrelevant. So in other words, I mean, I think I may at least partially agree with this, that what he's saying is, if you could take a godlike perspective and actually think about whether to make the choice to suspend the reactive attitudes, your decision shouldn't simply be a matter of whether determinism is true. It will be made on other considerations. So even if you are an incompatibilist, the other considerations have to come in, that determinism rules out sourcehood or alternative possibilities, and then responsibility requires those things, and so it would be unfair. Those are ancillary considerations. It doesn't follow just from the general doctrine of determinism that you should or should not suspend the reactive attitude. So that's a little more charitable reading of him. Yeah, though I think, I mean, I'm sorry. No, go ahead. Well, one thing is, you know, when people think that we should interpret Strawson charitably, I can't help being reminded of how uncharitable he is to his critics, or I mean, certainly to the libertarians, who he accuses of embracing a panicky metaphysics and pitiful or pathetic intellectual trinkets like agent causation. And against their own yeah, now, of course, two wrongs don't make a right, so I suppose it's not okay to be uncharitable just because someone else has been uncharitable. But the proponents of the Strawsonian view who are so quick to jump on anyone who raises any questions and want to make sure that Strawson is maximally charitably interpreted overlook the fact that he's absolutely egregious with regard to, you know, how he portrays his opponents. And in the it's interesting because he says, look, I'm engaged in this reconciliation project. I want to bring everyone together so we all sing Kumbaya in a circle. And then he goes ahead and accuses the libertarian of panicky metaphysics.
You on both sides merely recognize that you're being morons all the time. Then maybe you can get a reconciliation.
Yeah, maybe.
A little bit autism.
That's right. Okay, any quick comments before we go? Okay, you promised it will be quick? Okay.
All right.
Okay.
I wonder, why should we worry about what should we think in a deterministic world? I mean, everything is determined. We'll just...
But everything, okay. It is a good point.
Well, that was a joke. I understand that worrying is also a part of the deterministic chain, and it will probably lead to something. Anyway, it's a pragmatic question. We would just adopt the point of view we liked. Each of us would take the point of view we like. Nothing else could be done, I guess.
So with regard to the point of view in regard to what?
To keeping regret and such.
Oh, I see, yeah, so each one...
In the deterministic world.
So that might happen, but I think it's interesting to ask, I think it's interesting to ask whether it would be appropriate or fitting or rational to continue to have the reactive attitudes or to give them up in a deterministic world. Now, it might be, in fact, right, you might be predicting what will happen, but it's interesting to ask what should happen. Okay, so I thought we got to talk about a lot of really interesting and difficult stuff today. And so maybe we ought to end today. And thanks very much to Matt. And he'll be leading the discussions tomorrow as well. So we'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow.